Hi everyone. Welcome back to Woo Can Cook. My name is Wesley, and this is a show where we are slowly cooking our way through all of the food from my childhood. Today we're diving back into our series dedicated to Chinese comfort food classics with a shot at a dish that's been on my list pretty much since I started this channel, which is the Cantonese dish known as salt and pepper pork chops, or Jiaoyan Zhupai. Now, some of you may be wondering, but Wesley, if it's been on your list for this long, why haven't you already cooked this dish? We're 200 recipes in. To which I would reply, I don't really know. There's a lot of food to make, y'all. In any case, for those unfamiliar, salt and pepper pork chops are a staple of Cantonese cuisine that you may find on the menu of pretty much any Chinese restaurant worth its salt, no pun intended. As the name implies, the dish relies heavily on the use of white pepper to create its iconic seasoning, although I have seen various iterations of this dish make use of Sichuan pepper in its dry seasoning. I might argue that this is honestly just incorrect, and in fact, it's specifically the absence of Sichuan pepper that brings the white pepper seasoning of this dish to life. Although more commonly you may come across this dish in restaurants done with bone-in pork chops, I've opted to do ours today instead with boneless pork loins so that we may capitalize on a knife work tip from the Omnivore's cookbook to create what is honestly one of the crispiest pieces of pork chop that I have ever created and easily tops any bone-in pork chop that I've ever had. Okay, so let's get into it. Okay, so before we dive in, I'll start off by mentioning right off the bat that unlike many of the dishes that we have done on this channel, I have had a lot of salt and pepper pork chops in my many years of consuming Chinese food, so I have a few opinions on how I think that this dish should be assembled properly, and in my opinion, the Jiaoyan Zhupai specifically must be garnished with and only with sliced fried garlic and jalapeno peppers. All other accompaniments that you may come across are incorrect. Under no circumstances should you be jamming 4 or 5 different vegetables in your pork chops today, y'all. Next up, moving on to our pork, I have 1 pound or 3 medium boneless pork loin here that I'm slicing into bite-sized pieces. Now, to be fair, pretty much every version of this dish that I have come across makes use of bone-in pork loin, which, if I'm being honest, does yield a slightly juicier piece of pork. It is also, however, if you ask me, one of the more annoying parts of eating this dish, since we'll have to eat around the bone with our hands on a plate served over rice. It just logistically doesn't really make very much sense to me. Like, what is the actual plan for eating this? So, all this to say, on researching how to reproduce this dish at home, I absolutely love this tip from the Omnivore's cookbook, which calls for boneless chops that have been sliced in angles like so, yielding thin, tapered ends to our bite-sized pork, which will go on to fry up into extra crispy tips. I'm adding this all to a bowl, then combining with a relatively simple marinade today. This is 4 tablespoons of soy sauce to start, followed by a single tablespoon each of Shaoxing wine and oyster sauce. Then finally, we're going to do a little bit of velveting here today since our pork chops are going to tend to be a little bit more chewy than chicken thigh. I'm combining a half teaspoon of baking soda and a 1/4 cup of water in a separate bowl, then mixing to combine with our pork chop and setting aside to marinate for 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, I'm separating my pork chops from as much of our liquid marinade as I possibly can, then combining with what ended up being a 1/2 cup or 8 tablespoons of cornstarch in my largest mixing bowl. Last up, in a separate bowl, I'm assembling our salt and pepper dry seasoning, which in fact contains a few more things than just salt and pepper, as you might have guessed. Up first, this is a single tablespoon of kosher salt here to start, followed by a 1/2 tablespoon of white pepper and a teaspoon each of garlic powder and onion powder. Finally, this is a 1/2 teaspoon of Chinese 5 spice to round this all out. Then I'm setting this aside for a moment while we head over to the stove. Over on the stove, I have my fryer heating up to 350 degrees F. Then I'm adding in my pork here about 12 to 15 pieces at a time and frying for about 3 to 4 minutes until deeply golden brown. At this point, you may notice that the biased angle that we cut into our pork chops have curled and crisped up into these perfectly crispy, crunchy edges, which easily make up for the lack of the bone-in chops, in my opinion. Moving on to our stir fry next, I've emptied out my wok here, then I'm heating it up over medium heat, adding 4 tablespoons of peanut oil and, as always, long yao for that nice non-stick surface. Then going in here first are my jalapenos. I'm giving these a short 2-minute head start here before following up with my garlic and frying for an additional 2 to 3 minutes until golden brown and fragrant. Once the house starts smelling like, well, garlic and jalapenos, and we have some golden brown garlic chips starting to form, I'm adding my pork chops back to the wok, then tossing to combine. Finally, I'm adding my dry seasoning in here to taste, and we're ready to eat. Okay, so I'll start off by mentioning that literally given any opportunity, this is easily my favorite dish to order at any Chinese restaurant specializing in Cantonese cuisine. This dish is just so simple but at the same time so flavorful and complex that it's almost always the highlight of any Lazy Susan family-style meal. The white pepper is rich in umami, brought to life by the garlic powder, onion powder, and five spice. Granted, I will admit that I think it was a little bit unusual assembling this dish with cubed pork loin rather than the more common bone-in pork chops. That said, I still think that unless you're going to serve this dish with 4 more stir-fries on the side for a large family meal, it just simply makes more logistical sense to do this with boneless chops, because you can eat it with rice out of a rice bowl. Why isn't this more common? I don't know. Finally, although I was initially concerned that the thinner edges created by chopping our pork chops at an angle might cause an uneven cook, they did in fact curl and crisp in the fry, sort of like a chicharron would do, yielding just the most uniquely crispy and crunchy piece of pork that you'll ever need in life. Okay, so that's it everyone. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you give this one a shot. For those who are new to the channel, this one is part of a larger series that we've been doing that's dedicated to classic Chinese dishes, so definitely check out that series next if you haven't yet, because there's a lot of these. As always, like, comment, subscribe, share, be nice YouTubers, and I'll see you soon. Bye.